Hi everyone, it's Murray here again with the week 2 wrap of the discussion forum. As per last week, the discussion questions were aimed not to produce right or wrong answers, but just to prompt some discussion. So I've really enjoyed reading your posts, and I enjoy reading how one post can prompt further questions and further inquiry and further learning. So thank you for your thoughtful contributions. There's still time this week to contribute if you haven't got around to it yet. This week it was about the stakeholder matrix, and hopefully you found that development of that matrix in your workbook useful to developing your list of stakeholders. The discussion question itself asked, who are the 2 most important stakeholders to your project? I intentionally left you out of this equation as well. I tend to think that you are likely to be the most important person in your research, and that you'll probably fulfill a number of roles. You'll certainly have a high degree of interest and hopefully a high degree of power. You probably also be a project manager, a team member, sometimes a customer, or sometimes even an end user. So the classic terminology for project management actually doesn't always directly equate to research projects. It's something we'll be teasing out throughout this module, and just looking how the terminology of project management does apply and how it produces grey areas. Hopefully, just through the interrogation of the concepts, you'll both appreciate what some of that terminology means and how it applies to the research context, rather than seeing it as right or wrong. Now, if we look at your responses to the discussion forum, overwhelmingly and perhaps unsurprisingly, the most frequently cited, most important stakeholder is your supervisor. This is certainly, I think, the case for participants in this module who are doing their PhD or their Masters by research, those that have a direct supervisor in that sort of relationship. I think there are also some postdocs in this module and early career researchers as well. And perhaps for them, the experience may be a little bit different. Maybe sponsors may be much more important to them. And the supervisor role is kind of seen in a different way. But overwhelmingly, supervisor was the most cited amongst you. There are other stakeholders as well, though, that were mentioned, and perhaps we can spend a little bit of time just examining some of the issues that revolved around them. One of the stakeholders that was mentioned by people were external examiners. And I think there was some discussion about how initially people hadn't considered examiners as an important stakeholder. Certainly their interest along the way of the project may be quite minimal, given they might not even know about your project until it arrives on their desk. But certainly their power is quite high, isn't it, when they're the one that determines whether you pass or not in the end for those that are doing studies in research. I think an unusual part of their role, particularly in the context of project management theory, is the fact that you never see them, where in most projects you'll know who your stakeholders are. So there are, I guess, other instances where you don't necessarily know them personally, like an end user in a traditional model. You don't always know who each end user of a particular project is. But end users don't often have as much power as an examiner. So yeah, it's an interesting observation that they can have so little involvement along the way of your project, but so much influence at the end of the project. End users as well, I mentioned, they can perhaps have a significant motivational factor in your research. even if they don't always rate so highly in their power or interest rating, they may be kind of in the back of your mind as the reason behind the research that you're doing in many cases. I think one way that end users are impacting the project is through their indirect involvement. So I've picked up this as something that I've learnt from the comments that you made, that there's an indirect power and a direct power. And perhaps this is one way of determining the relationship between the stakeholder and you. I think there was some comment about the difficulty in determining the amount of power that stakeholders might have. And so looking at the directness of their influence is one way that you can determine this. Maybe another way might be to look at their substitutability. Can you take that particular stakeholder out of the equation and replace it with another one? That might be an indication of their power as well. You might be able to do that with participants in a piece of research, take one participant out and bring another one in, but maybe not so easy to do it with examiners or supervisors, for example. Possible, but not easy. Another interesting stakeholder that I saw in the discussion was the inclusion of family. And aren't they really important to the delivery of your project? Given that they might not have such direct involvement in the content of what you're doing, but certainly a high indirect influence, if not in the content, then in financial support perhaps, and also emotional support. So I think for many, family is also one that you might not have initially thought of, but on reflection, they're a super important part in being successful in your research project. So that's just a few of my observations. Hopefully you found them useful. There is a number of comments and questions that people are posting throughout the week. So I strongly encourage you to return throughout the week to see if someone has responded to your comments and to see if there's anything else that you can respond to. So I look forward to seeing you next week, where we'll be discussing project processes and life cycle.